Thank you very much, Professor. The amazing words that you mentioned, Professor, sound like a heavenly dream to me. How I wish they were practical, because what you're talking about is right. Unfortunately, some of us that live at the continent in real time are faced with a stark difference between the ideal and the real. I definitely agree with all the ideas here. But one great man, one great writer from Nigeria called Chinua Achebe was asked in the 1980s what Africa's problem was. And he said, Africa's problem are not the rivers or the lakes or the mirrors. Africa's problem is leadership. Even our own Yoweri Museveni, he wrote a book called What is Africa's Problem? And he's quoted famously to have said in 1986 that Africa's problem in general, and Uganda, where I come from in particular, are the leaders that overstay power. So we all should agree that it all begins and ends with leadership. Leadership is the difference between these beautiful ideas and the real catastrophe and the real tragedy that we meet. It should not be rocket science for Africans to build trust. We have been through too much not to have trust for one another. But to see, and I give it as an example that a wonderful country like South Africa, which is supposed to be the most landed country, has chosen to be the embodiment of self-hate. Not just the people, I repeat, not just the people, but the leadership too. Where you see the president calling self-hating Africans that are standing against their fellow brothers and sisters just because of their skin color. And we endorse them with a presidential meeting asserting that it is all right for us to carry ourselves in such a way. It is leadership. This belief, or there's an idea, and you've talked about the federating, organizations, East African Community, this ECOWAS and all these. They're beautiful ideas. But I had to mention that these are reduced to only presidential clubs. If we must bring Africa together, it is not the leaders. These federations must not be political. They should be social to begin with, bringing people together, not bringing leaders together. Because leaders use them just to look out for each other's power and to consolidate each other's stay in power. Otherwise, almost 70 years later, why are we still divided by these borderlines? As an artist, I would only reduce this in a little a cappella and say, it was not our choice in 1884 in Berlin when them sit up on the table in the scramble and petition for African land. Right now we're living by the borderlines. It would be easier if I never had to get a visa to see my little sister in Tunisia or Namibia. But look here, 142 years later, we are still living by the borderlines. And why can't we see its divide and rule? Why do we act like colonial tools? The African unity becoming a reality. We should abolish the borderlines, like Professor said. But that will not come as a miracle. Deliberate steps will have to be taken, and that all goes back to leadership. While our current leaders are throwing around the word Pan-Africanism as a playing card, they don't believe in what they say. Or at least their actions don't represent that, because In the case of Uganda, General Museveni receives up to $1 billion every year in military support and all that from the United States. Why then would he have policies that empower Africans? So it is with leadership. These steps must be taken by the people to assert themselves and hold leaders accountable and ensure that leaders drive Africa into a direction that they want. Other than that, I want to believe that each president wants to keep their own enclave. One that has Kenya will keep their Kenya alone. One that has Uganda, Zimbabwe, Ghana, each one will want to keep their own enclave alone so they can control their own people. These, in my view, are only farm managers. It's just a continuation of neocolonialism. I'm sorry to mention or to be too blunt. But thank you.
You're right. But I want to add a caveat to it because my area of study is around leadership and change. And I always say it's about misleadership. And leader and leadership are different. And even though in leadership studies, there's no real unified definition of leadership, but one that I usually work with is taking initiative on behalf of shared values. That's leadership. And so it's not, particular, anybody could initiate leadership. Our mothers demonstrate leadership because they take initiative on behalf of shared values every day. You understand? But to your point, it is that divide and conquer is based on the colonialism. You understand? And so this is why mass movements are important. So it is through mass movement that things are going to change. It's not through some individual who could be swayed by $1 billion, in the country and so forth. That we have to look at it. So I think that so trust is based on the kind of relationships that we have and the things that the work that we actually do. I think that part of it, particularly around those in the diaspora, those African Americans, right, is where the curriculum in Africa, and I don't know, I just want to know because I haven't seen it, where there's in the curriculum, in the schools, they teach about the Ma'afa, they teach about how we got to the diaspora, how we got to the Americas, right? And who is, lighting that candle for us to come back, right? And talking about that, and because this is how you begin to bridge the gap. But as a brother Rodney said, is that if if we are looking at who is in fact the ones who are teaching us and providing the cultural framework for us, and we expect them to liberate us. That's not happening. So they've been choosing to lead us for us. This is the exact point that's happening in Cuba today, right? It's like we want a regime change, and we will hurt your children. We'll let them die. We won't let them have any oil or electricity until the leadership change. So they're not worried about the people. They're worried about who they can put there to say, well, these are the business transactions we want to make or we want to do, and you can benefit. That's not in Cuba. That's in Africa. That's been in Africa. What happened to Patrice Lumumba? Right? What happened to the African leaders who have been assassinated? And what will happen if we don't protect those who are standing up on principle and demonstrating leadership based on the needs of the people and taking initiative on behalf of shared values? So trust goes a long way in terms of how we begin to educate people about the divide, about the history of what's happening and how Africa has gotten to the point that it's gotten to. Because even here, everybody in this room, have an important role to play in sort of addressing the misleadership and misunderstanding they have about themselves and our responsibility. Because ultimately, it's our responsibility in terms of what we do. But we make decisions because we end up being collaborators with the same system that oppresses us because we scared. We scared. Right? We addicted like a dope fiend to the privileges that they give us, right? And it was really to challenge them, right? And there was a saying, I think the last poet said, blessed are those who struggle, for oppression is worse than the grave. It is better